This is MRC Uncensored. I'm Dan Schneider. I am pleased to have on our show today one of the greatest comedians in America, Kozak. I first became familiar with Ami when I saw his impersonation of Prince Harry and mocking Harry and his wife's wokeism. My wife and I cannot get enough of his impersonations. But with the recent attacks and terrorist assaults on Israel, Ami has chosen to step out of the comedic role and to address real important policy matters. Ami, I am so glad that you're with us today. Why don't you tell us a little bit about why you got involved in this issue?
Thank you, Dan. Good to be with you, and thank you for having me. I appreciate the kind words. And how come you shut his whites? That's disgusting. It's anyway, we can get back to that. But anyway, I can talk about that. Sure. I generally have always used I've always used my social media platforms as and consider them a place for entertainment, as you said. That's how you found me. Impersonations, impressions, music. I'm a musician as well. And you know, I generally don't take the approach of being overtly political on them or using them as a place to also voice politics. Not because I'm afraid of my opinions being out there in any way. I also host a podcast in which it gets more open into my political views. But generally speaking, I find that entertainment is a great unifier, and especially comedy is a great unifier across political lines. We can all laugh at similar things that we find funny. But when it came to the recent attacks on Israel, there's two things that are important to note. For one, it is very personal to me. I am a Jew. I have family and friends there. And so this trauma was beyond some story in the news. I took this very, very personally for me, and therefore it affected me. And I didn't personally feel like doing comedy, but on a bigger, more philosophical level, what was going on in the attacks on Israel and the response in the West to it goes well beyond politics, to the point where I think if we think about comedy more deeply, the only reason it's even allowed to exist in the way that exists in a free society is when we all agree to fight for the values and the principles that allow for comedy to exist in the first place. Mm. And if we don't fight for those principles, when we see them being perverted, confused, or violated, then comedy's days are numbered.
Yeah, so this reminds me that we've sort of seen this routine before. The New York Times was the place for people to get their news back in the 30s and the 1940s. But the New York Times was not reporting on the Holocaust, was not reporting on what Hitler was up to. Time magazine actually gave Hitler the Man of the Year award. Back then, Americans and people across the world had limited resources to find out what was going on, to get their information. Some might call it the news, some might call it propaganda at that time. We now have social media where people can access information that they couldn't before. The New York Times no longer is the monopolist on information. You've got a massive following. You've got a lot of influence on the internet. That influence stems primarily from your comedy. You've got a lot of fans who love your work, and now you've decided to use that platform for a different kind of good. Have you seen evidence of success?
Yeah, certainly, you know, the sense of fulfillment or validation that I would get from a video that does well on this subject and reaches a lot of people is a very different kind of feeling or sense of satisfaction than a funny video that goes, quote, viral or gets attention. When something that's entertaining for the purposes of pure entertainment to make people laugh gets a lot of attention, then that feels good. It feels nice. It's nice to know that I'm making people laugh. This one almost hurts in a way. It's almost like when you're trying to tell the truth to the best of your ability, the more the people resonate with it, there's almost a pain that comes with it. It feels satisfying. It feels good to be saying what you think is right and saying what you believe is true, and that to be affirmed and validated by a lot of people. It feels good in a different kind of way, in a painful kind of way. I would not want to have to do these things if I didn't feel I had to do them. So feeling compelled to make these videos and getting the validation, it's almost, you know, I've consumed, obviously, if you've watched a lot of my content, a lot of Jordan Peterson videos, and I'm not trying to compare myself to him, but at the risk of doing so, you know, when he's when people ask him about what it's like for him to have impact through his kind of work that's affecting people in a positive way, he talks about the overwhelming sort of pain, the good, satisfying kind of pain that's mixed with it, because to know that somebody's been going through something and you've changed them or provided a sort of clarity on a moral level, it feels good, but you wish you didn't have to do it.
The best comedy does seem to be in the space where people are uncomfortable. And then finding the absurdity in those sorts of things. I don't think there's comedy to be found now in what we've seen Hamas do. The terrorism, the butchery, the savagery, the Satanism, the sort of abhorrent things that we have seen them, and we do not need to recount those things now. So that as you have gone to social media to describe these horrors, how many responses have you gotten from kind of the crowd that sort of blindly follows the Hamas teachings, who blindly follows the propaganda against Israel?
Yeah, so I think it's very hard in a moment of like when emotions are running high after a tragedy and trauma to try to parse the differences, and I don't really care to in a sense, but if I have to examine it as objectively as I possibly can be about it, I didn't necessarily make the videos to convince people who want Israel's utter destruction or are anti-Semitic to the core. I'm really not trying to reach them, although if it does and somehow persuades them, great. But I don't expect the videos to do that. I think, one of the things I'll say overall is that this event has really illuminated everything. It's illuminated a lot of the moral bankruptcy, perversion, and confusion out there. The moral perversion that exists in sort of the far left circles of our culture that view everything through the lens of oppressor and oppressed, through attributing everybody to specific group identities. And therefore, any time a group falls into the category of the group that's prosperous or has things, they are necessarily the villain. And any group that falls under the perceived underdog are necessarily the hero. And you don't base your morality on individual rights. You are able to justify atrocity because you dehumanize everybody. You certainly dehumanize the people you're committing atrocity against as if it's somehow virtuous.
Yeah, I've been gratified, frankly, to see people like Jake Tapper on CNN and others to say this has been a real wake-up call for, and he's referring to himself, of course, when he refers to Democrats and progressives, he's referring to the media, the legacy media, in the same breath. That it's been a wake-up call for them to see the anti-Semitism that exists on the left. But Jake Tapper now and others I think they're waking up, and so many people are realizing that what we have seen come out of Hamas shows that where the evil lies, the real evil lies. And I think it's causing lots of people to reevaluate many of their thinking on political ideas.
Yes, I think it's helpful to categorize these perverse ideas, not always in terms of hard left and hard right, but more in terms of which people believe in collectivism versus individualism, the sovereignty and sanctity of each individual that has inalienable rights as a human being, and judging each person as an individual versus judging them in terms of part of a collective group in this sort of tribal warfare scenario where, it's that intersectional view of how society should operate and attributing who is virtuous and who is villainous by those standards. But there is no monopoly on atrocity when it comes to the fringes of extremism. And, in the words of Jordan Peterson, he's always asked, I think we've seen when the right can go too far. The question is, when does the left go too far? And now we've seen it in crystallized terms. We see it clearly.
I've known lots of actors, and there's one thing that sort of is common among many actors, is that their intelligence level is below 100 IQ points. The comedians I've known, their IQ is well north of 100 points. You can't be a comedian, you can't be funny unless you're really, really smart. And you know language. So you're using language and your comedic expressions now to put a spotlight on the horrors of terrorism, on the horrors that we've seen come out of the leadership of Hamas.
Well, to your point about comedians and intelligence, where I can comment on that is that the same instinct that makes something, identifies something as funny, is the same instinct that identifies something as true. If something doesn't have a sparkle or resonant frequency of truth to it, it won't connect to an audience and be funny. Now, you have to toe the line, and there's a subjectivity as to what people find funny or not. But one thing that's true throughout comedy, and it's true of a lot of art, is that you're touching on some sort of truth that people can't deny, which is why they laugh at something. Because even if it's uncomfortable or it's not politically correct, what makes something funny to people is an involuntary reaction to some undeniable truth that you're joking about or hinting at or exaggerating. You're shining a mirror on the parts of society maybe we don't want to talk about in normal civilized society, or maybe we don't want to always face. But comedy can really do that in a very powerful way.
So, of course, the Squad is a well-known small group of leftists in Congress, and they can't seem to see reality. They can't seem to appreciate the horrors that have been committed by Hamas and easily judge evil from good. But they've got a lot of followers who are starting to ask questions. Ami, how do you explain this human nature among people who have a hard time distinguishing or trying to decide which side they need to be on?
Yeah, I made a couple of videos relating to this. One calling out the Squad directly, and then one basically calling out all progressive groups who don't stand in solidarity with Israel in this moment, because especially the more progressive groups, Queers for Palestine, artists and musicians, journalists out there, my fundamental question to them, first of all, is, let's say I grant them all of their arguments. Like, what exactly are they fighting for when they tweet hashtag Free Palestine? What kind of world are they fighting for? And then I pose the questions to them, like all the rights and values that they claim to fight for: free speech, freedom of the press, artistic expression, the freedom to love who you want to love, regardless of sexual orientation, just the freedom to be. Like, do they think that would exist in Gaza or the West Bank? Do those values, are those preserved in those places? If you're a journalist in Gaza, can you freely criticize the Hamas regime? If you're an artist or musician in Gaza, can you make whatever music you want to make? Can you dress however you wanted to dress? As if you're a designer, could you be gay in Gaza? Could you be openly homosexual in these places? Like, what exactly are they even fighting for as an ends when they say from the river to the sea? What kind of world? So that is just a glaring glitch contradiction to me, which I cannot understand. And that's a genuine question to them, you know, and it's just incredibly frustrating when a lot of times they peddle this idea that the story is just started in the middle, that there's a security wall on the West Bank, just because there is. Nothing was happening that prompted Israel to put it up. Nothing was happening on the Gaza border on October 7th. All of a sudden, there's just this crisis that's just wrong, qua wrong. There's no reason for it. And like, I'm so frustrated by this narrative about, you know, it's the occupation that has led to this terrorism. I don't even like the word occupation. It is a misnomer historically. Without getting too much into the weeds of wonky history, occupation by definition means one sovereign country takes over another existing sovereign country, which is not the case in the history of Israel. The name Palestine is a name of a piece of land, a piece of geography under the Ottoman Empire, then under the British Empire, occupied by them, and then granted to Israel and Jews as part of a UN partition plan to split the land, which was obviously always rejected by the Arab nations. Israel won territory in 2 defensive wars. I'm going to try to say this all in one breath so people get the history right. In 2 defensive wars, Israel conquered territory, and since then it has been disputed territory, so there is no occupied territory. But let's say for the sake of argument, I grant them it is occupied territory. Remember something, occupied in terms of security presence of Israel to monitor what's going on. Why do they do that? Why do they put up a wall? Why is there a security presence in Israel? There is no more occupation of Gaza since 2005. Why is there a security presence there? Well, that's because there has been a continual reinforcement of firing rockets into Israel, suicide bombers, aggression, and attacks continually. So my main point is to say it is not occupation that leads to terrorism. It is terrorism that leads to occupation. So I just can't stand this backwards equation that's being peddled here. Anyway, I don't even remember the question, but
well, let me just add.
That's a point I needed to make again. And these people in the squad who were so quick to call out Me Too, sexual harassment in the workplace, cases of rape in the United States, say nothing about mass rape of Israelis. They say, when they talk about the separation of migrant children at the border from their parents, they say nothing about the kidnapping of Israeli children from their parents. It's only Israel's response to getting them back that should be condemned. That is morally perverse, backwards, and it's unforgivable. And to not comment on it, talk about a tribal blind allegiance or some moral confusion. Yeah, this is not progressive. This is not liberal. This is not tolerant. This is apologists for atrocity and barbarism.
When the left claims that Israel is an apartheid state, I always sort of just shake my head in disbelief because they ignore the fact that I think 20% of Israelis are actually Arab and worshippers of Islam. And these Israelis, just like all other Israelis, have the right to vote. They do, in fact, serve in the Knesset. They do, in fact, serve in the Israeli Defense Force. They are full citizens of Israel. There are 55 Muslim nations on the planet. And the reason I think we can say with 99% accuracy that we do not find apartheid in those 55 countries is because the Jews have either been forced out of those countries or they've been exterminated. So there's not a Jewish population to oppress or to separate. Israel is the one Middle Eastern country where there are people of all faiths and allowed to be not only citizens, but full-fledged citizens with full rights. It's bizarre to me that people would call that an apartheid state.
It's really rich that they are claiming Israel is an apartheid state while arguing for a Jew-free Palestine across all of the river to the sea land in Israel right now. So they're calling for a state that is Jew-free, no Jews allowed. So you see the hypocrisy, the contradiction, and the moral perversion of these things. The funny thing is, like supporting Hamas on the basis of liberal human rights principles. I mean, it's Orwellian. If there's no other way to describe it, this is 2 + 2 is 5. That's how deep it goes in terms of the moral blindness and backwardness of these cases that they're making against Israel. So you're left with no other conclusion to draw other than the fact that this is not about the creation of a Palestinian state. It's not about geography. It's not a regional dispute. This is about the non-existence of a Jewish state, and that's what it's always been.
So we've seen how Google actually manipulates search results. We just did a study that showed that Google's own artificial intelligence system, Bard, will not tell you what Hamas is. It'll tell you what the Irish Republican Army is. It'll tell you what Black Lives Matter is, but it will not tell you what Hamas is. And strangely enough, Google also can no longer tell you where Jerusalem is. It can tell you where the capitals of its neighbors are, but Jerusalem has fallen off the map, so has Tel Aviv. So given that, Ami, what can social media produce for us when some of these platforms are bizarre, where Hamas is able to put its own propaganda and images of terrorism online?
I generally take the approach that the solution to bad speech is more speech. This is the arena that we all exist in now. This is where the attention is. So anything in the modern technological context that we find ourselves in, that's where we are. So trying to run away from it or criticize the arena in which we're all playing or it is probably counterproductive. Best to make better contributions to it, better contributions to the marketplace of ideas, as opposed to saying, oh my God, all these conversations are being watered down or prevented. Find the channels that you can and the platforms that you can to put out what you believe is true as you see it, adding to the discourse, adding to the dialogue. And you sort of are, if you have a poisonous well of water full of, you could either try to get rid of it or just keep diluting it with clean water until eventually the clean outweighs the dirty.
As you're speaking here, I keep on hearing my favorite one of your bits, which is Prince Harry. When he was asked what kind of fish he would like, was it Chilean sea bass?
There was one night we were having a royal dinner at the palace, and Em and I were sitting, and they offered us blackened salmon. which was obviously a dig at Meghan. But for my brother and his wife, they preferred Chilean sea bass, which is a whitefish, and it hurt.
Both you and Meghan had the blackened salmon. Your brother had the sea bass.
Yeah.
Was it good?
Oh no, it was delicious.
That doesn't sound so problematic.
Well, I think the British press would have you believe that through leaks. There's certainly unconscious bias. And I love my brother. I love my family.
So for my audience who might not be familiar with you, I really encourage you to Google Ami Kozak and Prince Harry and read or listen to, watch his various Prince Harry impersonations. And I just have to ask you, do you in fact love your brother?
I love my brother and I love my family, but it's hurtful. There's a lot of unconscious bias there. And what I'll say is this, when it comes to the Jewish people, there's actually a lot of conscious bias, and that is hurtful.
Ami Kozak, I really appreciate you being with us. You are somebody who's really having an impact on helping young people in particular kind of think through some of these issues, which for some of us are easy to address and resolve in our minds. Other people are struggling with it. Thank you so much for being with us. This is MRC Uncensored. We'll see you next week.
Thank you so much. Good to be with you.